When we identify a measure of the characteristics required for the job, we need to figure out what the results actually mean, which seems like it'd be pretty simple, but isn't. In many cases, thinking about the meaning of the results and how they can be used actually starts before someone takes the test, because the way a measure is developed and administered can influence what the responses mean. Each assessment typically results in a score, but the score in and of itself isn't usually very meaningful. Like when you see the number of points you can earn on an assignment and don't know how well you did without knowing how many points were possible and how it influences the grade in a class. The meaning of assessment scores depends on how we're interpreting them. When we're interpreting scores for selection systems, we typically want to know how the scores compare to some standard. One approach to establishing the standard is to consider what's necessary to perform the job at an acceptable level. That'd be criterion-referenced interpretation. Another approach would be to determine how a person's score compares to other people's scores. That's called norm-referenced interpretation. You may have gathered that selection systems usually include more than one assessment. Each assessment can raise concerns about bias and fairness, not to mention added time and expense. Given that, we also want to ask what the score on one assessment adds to what we know from other assessments. Incremental validity asks, does a particular score in this assessment add to what we know about how well someone will do? Thinking about that reminds us that ultimately, the meaning of the scores relate to performance. I/O has a long and strong history of developing assessments and encouraging the use of valid assessments. It's interesting to realize part of that history, one that's influential to the discipline, was developing assessments for military efforts. The book explains more about that, but it seems like there are two recurring themes that are as important now as they were in the past. One is the potential for bias because of the way an assessment was developed or administered, and the second is fairness. Even if we establish the validity of an assessment and ensure it does not have bias, the scores used to classify individuals represent a value judgment, and therefore they have the potential to be unfair to particular groups. I mentioned one example in the recording about physical ability tests. Taken together then, the potential for bias and for lack of fairness means we have to be really deliberate when we administer an assessment in organizations. Depending on the source of the test, the questions may be more or less biased. If it's not administered in the same way to each person, it could mean the results mean different things because of the amount of time provided or the instructions given. So when we're thinking about selection systems, a score on an assessment should help us understand how well someone will perform a job. The meaning of a particular score, though, will depend on how we interpret it. It's also important to remember that assessment results can be influenced by things other than an individual's actual knowledge, skills, and abilities. Even when they aren't influenced by outside factors, decisions based on the scores may not be fair.